So if we were to look at a diagram of IT services, which is meant to encompass all the functions and components of an IT organization, we could see that IT services can be broken down into discrete parts and organized into categories. Now, I'm not going to go into all the individual boxes here, but I want to take note of those categories. At the top, we have service delivery, and the service delivery section is the part of IT that interfaces with the rest of the company. This is the part that contains the components that the business can quantify, measure, and evaluate in order to determine if IT is meeting its value proposition. Now, on the right, the operations and management portions represent the functions of the IT professionals, and the ultimate goal of these is to standardize and automate as many of these processes as possible. Now, the big ones, the infrastructure, platform, and software sections, those represent the physical and virtual assets that are being used to generate the service deliverables, as well as what is being managed by the IT department. So, now that we can separate all of these components and quantify them and measure them, we can begin to define what their service level should be. And once we know what their service level should be, we then can evaluate vendors for outsourcing and begin to discuss service level agreements between us and the provider. The decision to know which of these to ship to third parties depends on the availability of adequate outsourcing resources or services specific to the company's industry, and the tolerance that the company has for risk and or using third parties. For certain specialized industries, there may not be a good selection of vendors to supply something like specialized software, so the company may only be able to outsource or host their infrastructure or platform and then have to develop their own application. In contrast, if a company is in a highly competitive industry with a lot of software providers, it may actually be important to outsource that application to a third party in order to achieve feature parity with other competitors. So if we think back to a few slides ago, we talked about the most common hosting models as being outsourcing of infrastructure, platforms, or software components. And the only real difference between them is in regard to what is customer managed and what is provider managed. Now these stacks are arranged from the application or software at the top down to the data centers at the bottom, which is physical. For the infrastructure and platform hosting models, a third-party provider manages the hardware and possibly the virtualization layer, while it's up to the customer to develop the application and the security that's set on top of it. Therefore, the provider is only responsible for ensuring that the platform or infrastructure is available to the customer. The performance and availability of the application itself is still the customer's responsibility. Now let's take a look at where it turns from gray to blue. This is the customer interface, which is usually accessed via a web portal, and that is where the customer interacts with and manages the provider portion of the stack. Now, the details of what equipment is at the bottom or managed by the provider is not necessarily known to the customer. The customer doesn't need to know what hardware, or in the case of SaaS, what platforms are being used to deliver the services that sit on top of it. They only need to know enough to manage the services that they're responsible for. Now, in the software as a service model, the entire stack is managed by the provider. Therefore, the entire business outcome of the application is the responsibility of the provider. So in order to deliver a service, whether it's infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, or application as a service, in a highly available manner, service providers normally employ multiple data centers. Sometimes there is one active data center with standby data centers that are ready to take over in the event of a failure. Sometimes there are multiple active data centers all existing simultaneously, although this can be fairly tricky and is only reserved for certain workloads. Since the customer is not managing the facilities or the hardware individually and only purchasing the services that are being delivered on top of them, there is no need for the customer to understand the service provider's network or its failover topology. Now, often providers will share this information about their backend infrastructure with customers as a point of pride or for increased transparency to make a sale, but it is not a necessary part of the transaction. So from the customer's perspective, all they know is that they have an internet connection, and through it they can connect to a service provider's network to consume an application or a platform or an infrastructure over a secure link. And it's not always a VPN, it can be SSL at this point. Now, if there were a failover, the customer wouldn't have to do anything. The failover would be automatic and invisible to the customer on the back end. This makes the interface between the customer and the service provider very important and a defining part of the cloud service. The customer must be in control of how the service is being utilized, and the ability to provision and manage resources on the fly without intervention from the service provider is important to the feasibility of using that provider for cloud services. So in summary, a cloud service is nothing more than a hosted service where the customer is not concerned with the components required to deliver the service. They are only concerned with the service itself, along with the SLA and the interface that's used to manage it. In this way, users can be responsible for applications without the requirement of the IT department, especially when delivering software as a service. These users are often called application owners, and it becomes their job to ensure the service provider is delivering on its SLA. It's now become a matter of vendor management instead of IT management, and there is no need for IT personnel to become involved. And this can often lead to problems, as many times business units can decide to go with an application hosting provider or a cloud software provider without understanding the associated risks of data loss or disaster recovery implications. However, the IT department feels it no longer concerns them since the business is working directly with the vendor. Unless otherwise told, IT departments generally assume that they are not responsible for all the company's data or availability of services, just the portion that they manage. So, what are some common cloud providers that we may be familiar with? Well, on the application or software as a service side, there are some email providers such as Gmail and Outlook.com. And for business applications, you have NetSuite, which is an online ERP system, Workday, which is an online HR system, and Salesforce, which is online CRM. As for platforms as a storage, you have storage platforms that are cloud-based, like Box or Dropbox or OneDrive, and these are used for file storage in the clouds. Or you have business platforms online, which are SharePoint Online, Force.com, Cloudera, SQL, CouchDB. And notice that Salesforce is a SaaS, or software as a service, where Force.com is a platform. And that's because Salesforce represents the actual CRM software, where Force.com is the platform on which you can build your own tools on. As far as infrastructure goes, Amazon Web Service and Azure both provide for virtual storage and virtual machines, where Rackspace and Iron Mountain offer physical infrastructure as a service. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about private clouds, because there's some real discrepancy between what people think private clouds are. Well, if we keep the same definitions that we've been working with, then we can see that a private cloud is just a way for an organization's IT department to deliver to its users applications or platforms through a self-service portal with some sort of automated management or operations. So in this model, it's the IT department who has become the service provider, and the various business departments or business units inside the organization that become the customers. In order for the IT department to allow for provisioning and management of resources in an automated fashion by these customers, there needs to be some form of predefined policies and automated workflows, as well as an interface that the customers can use in the same way they would if they were to use a third-party provider. Now, vendors often sell these private cloud solutions as converged infrastructures, which is just servers, networking, storage, and virtualization sold all together as one rack of hardware, as well as the automated workflow and management interfaces, which is very important to make it a complete private cloud solution. But it's then up to the IT department to deploy these solutions in a manner so that they can deliver on the SLAs they have with their customers, meaning the end users, by designing a network with multiple data centers and automated failovers. So, just like before, from the end user's perspective, all they see is the self-service portal, and they have no knowledge of the infrastructure that's supporting it. The only difference in this case is the infrastructure is hosted internally, and all the components are managed by the company's IT department. In fact, as you can see from this Microsoft diagram, their definition of a private cloud infrastructure is the ability for an application owner to use a self-service portal to access automated processes that interface with IT tools designed to perform various tasks, including provisioning and management on back-end infrastructure that exists in multiple locations. It even shows that the service provider in this case is the data center administrator. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our cloud discussion. There was a lot there, but I think it's important we level set on what the cloud is before we go any further into managing a cloud environment. Next up, we're going to be discussing identities, directory services, and single sign-on.